Ancient Egypt. Pyramids, pharaohs, mummies. Glorious history, right? But let's pause for a second. Not everyone was living like a king. In fact, for the average farmer in ancient Egypt, life kinda sucked. And today, we're going to find out why. First off, let's talk about the daily grind. Life as a farmer in ancient Egypt was far from glamorous. Unlike the pharaohs, priests, and nobles, who lived in opulent palaces and adorned themselves with gold and jewelry, the average farmer's world was small, labor-intensive, and dictated almost entirely by the rhythms of nature. The Nile River was the lifeblood of Egypt, its flooding cycles determining the success or failure of crops, and by extension, the survival of entire communities. For a farmer, the year was divided not by months or festivals, but by the natural agricultural calendar of the Nile, the inundation, the sowing, and the harvest. Every day, week, and month revolved around these three essential periods, leaving little room for rest or personal freedom. During the inundation season, the Nile overflowed its banks, covering the surrounding fields with a layer of rich black silt. This silt was highly fertile, making it perfect for growing the crops that would feed the population, but it also meant the land was often waterlogged and difficult to navigate. Farmers spent hours wading through ankle-deep or sometimes knee-deep water, preparing the fields for planting once the floodwaters receded. This was a critical time. The success of the year's harvest depended on careful management of the fields during this period. Any mistake could lead to poor yields, and poor yields meant hunger, debt, or even starvation for the family. Farmers didn't have modern tools, fertilizers, or irrigation systems to fall back on. Their work was manual, repetitive, and physically demanding. When the inundation receded, the real work began. Farmers had to plow the heavy, clay-rich soil, often using simple wooden plows pulled by oxen or donkeys. Plowing was exhausting, especially under the relentless sun of the Egyptian desert. Sweat soaked their clothes and ran down their backs, mixing with the dust and sand to create a gritty, uncomfortable coating. Blisters, cuts, and sunburn were common, and without proper medicine or sanitation, even minor injuries could become serious infections. The farmers' hands were calloused, their muscles sore, and their bodies constantly fatigued from bending, lifting, digging, and planting. They spent long hours sowing seeds by hand, carefully spacing each one to ensure maximum growth. Precision was important, but so was speed, because the land and the season waited for no one. The choice of crops was limited and dictated by both climate and societal needs. Wheat and barley were staples, providing the grains necessary for bread and beer, the two most important elements of the Egyptian diet. Flax was grown for linen, while vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and lentils supplemented the diet. Fruit trees such as date palms were cultivated when possible, but they required more care and attention. Farmers had to balance immediate needs, feeding their families, with the demands of the state. The government claimed a significant portion of all crops as taxes, meaning that a farmer might labor for months only to see the majority of his produce taken away. In addition to plowing and planting, farmers were responsible for maintaining irrigation canals. Ancient Egypt relied on a complex system of canals, dikes, and basins to control the flow of water from the Nile, ensuring that fields received sufficient moisture without being flooded. Repairing these canals was grueling work. Mud had to be shoveled, embankments reinforced, and weeds cleared. Crocodiles, snakes, and other hazards lurked in the water, posing constant threats to those laboring along the banks. Farmers had to be vigilant at all times, or risk injury or death while performing essential tasks. The sheer monotony of this work, combined with its danger and physical strain, made life incredibly harsh. But it wasn't just the physical labor that made being a farmer in ancient Egypt so difficult. Farmers were essentially under the control of the state and local authorities. They had little autonomy and were often subject to harsh oversight. Officials would inspect fields, measure yields, and enforce quotas, making sure that the taxes due to the government were met. Complaints or requests for leniency were usually ignored or met with punishment. Farmers couldn't simply choose to rest when they were exhausted or sick. Their entire livelihood was dependent on complying with the demands of those in power, leaving them little room for personal agency. Socially, farmers were also at the bottom of the hierarchy. While respected for their essential role in sustaining life, they were not afforded the luxuries or privileges of wealthier citizens. Education was limited, literacy was rare, and opportunities for upward mobility were scarce. Children were often expected to begin helping in the fields from a young age, learning through observation and labor rather than formal instruction. Families worked together, but the burden of labor was heavy and unrelenting. The concept of leisure, as we understand it today, was almost non-existent. Festivals and religious ceremonies sometimes provided brief respites from work, but these events often required participation in additional labor or service, such as preparing food or offerings for the gods. Health was another constant concern. Farmers were exposed to harsh environmental conditions, including extreme heat, intense sun, and frequent dust storms. Malnutrition was common, especially when harvests failed or taxes were particularly demanding. Parasites, infections, and diseases spread rapidly among agricultural communities. Life expectancy was relatively short, and survival often required enduring hardships that would be unimaginable by modern standards. Even the simplest tasks, such as fetching water from the Nile or carrying a basket of grain, could be dangerous due to uneven terrain, wildlife, and exhaustion. Despite these hardships, farmers were indispensable. They provided the food necessary for the entire society, including the elites who lived in palaces and temples. Their work fueled the economy, supported the construction of monumental architecture like the pyramids, and maintained the daily functioning of the state. Yet recognition for their labor was minimal, and rewards were modest. They lived lives of constant toil, their days marked by repetition, unpredictability, and vulnerability to forces beyond their control. The psychological toll of such a lifestyle cannot be overstated. Endless labor with little personal freedom, exposure to natural dangers, and the constant pressure to meet quotas created stress, anxiety, and a sense of helplessness. Farmers had to endure the relentless cycle of planting and harvesting, hoping each year that the Nile's flood would be favorable and that their crops would survive. The fear of famine, theft, or disease was ever present. Community life offered some support, but each individual or family ultimately relied on their own strength and resilience to survive. Additionally, farming tools and techniques were primitive by modern standards. Wooden plows were heavy and difficult to maneuver. Irrigation relied on manual labor using shadufs, simple lever systems with buckets to lift water from canals, and these devices required constant attention and maintenance. Seeds had to be sown carefully by hand, and weeds were removed manually. Every step of the process demanded patience, skill, and endurance. Mistakes could be costly, and there was little margin for error. The landscape itself was both a blessing and a curse. The fertile soil of the Nile Valley provided the opportunity for abundant harvests, yet it was also subject to flooding, droughts, and unpredictable weather patterns. Farmers were constantly at the mercy of environmental forces, relying on observation, experience, and tradition to make decisions about planting, irrigation, and harvesting. Even with careful planning, success was never guaranteed. A single season of poor rainfall or an unexpected pest infestation could undo months of hard work and put entire families at risk. Furthermore, farmers were expected to contribute labor to state projects beyond their fields. During periods of non-farming work, they might be conscripted to build canals, temples, or pyramids, or to transport materials for the state. These obligations added to their already immense workload, leaving little time for rest or personal pursuits. The physical demands of such labor were extreme, often resulting in exhaustion, injury, or permanent disability. Culturally, farmers participated in the religious and social life of their communities, but these activities often intertwined with their labor obligations. Religious festivals, while celebratory, required farmers to provide food, labor, and offerings. Their participation was both a spiritual duty and a social expectation. Failure to comply could result in social ostracism or punishment, further emphasizing the lack of autonomy in their lives. Even leisure and cultural engagement were inseparable from the demands of survival. In terms of diet, farmers had access to simple staples like bread, onions, leeks, and occasionally fish or meat. While sufficient to sustain life, these foods provided minimal variety and nutrition. Meals were functional rather than pleasurable, designed to fuel the body for continued labor rather than enjoyment. Hunting or fishing was limited, and livestock was often kept for agricultural purposes rather than consumption. This restricted diet reflected the broader constraints of a life dominated by work, scarcity, and dependence on the natural environment. Education and knowledge were practical rather than theoretical. Farmers learned skills through apprenticeship within families, observing and participating in agricultural tasks from an early age. Knowledge of the land, seasons, weather patterns, and crop management was passed down orally and through direct experience. Literacy and formal education were rare, reserved for the elites, scribes, and officials. As a result, farmers' expertise was grounded in hands-on practice rather than scholarly study, emphasizing practical wisdom over intellectual pursuits. Finally, the sense of community among farmers was vital for survival. Families and neighbors often worked together to manage irrigation, repair canals, and protect fields from pests or theft. Social bonds provided support, shared labor, and mutual assistance in times of need. However, even within these communities, inequality existed. Wealthier farmers, or those with access to better land and resources, had advantages, while poorer families struggled to survive, highlighting the pervasive challenges of agricultural life. In short, being a farmer in ancient Egypt meant living a life defined by labor, risk, and dependence on forces beyond one's control. From the intensity of the sun to the unpredictability of the Nile, from harsh taxes to the physical demands of manual farming, each day was a test of endurance. Farmers were essential to society, yet they experienced little recognition, modest rewards, and relentless hardship. Their lives were structured by necessity, survival, and obligation, leaving them with little personal freedom, comfort, or security. Despite these challenges, they persevered, cultivating the land and sustaining a civilization that would be remembered for millennia. Their labor, resilience, and endurance were the backbone of ancient Egyptian society, and though often overlooked in historical narratives, their experiences provide a stark and humbling perspective on the realities of life in one of history's greatest civilizations. Speaking of fractions, let's dive into one of the most frustrating and relentless aspects of being a farmer in ancient Egypt: taxes. And no, I'm not talking about the modern kind that comes with a little paperwork and an occasional receipt. I'm talking about the kind of taxes that could take most of what you grew, leaving you and your family scrambling to survive on whatever scraps remained. Taxes in ancient Egypt were not collected in coins or money, at least not for the majority of farmers, because the vast majority of the population didn't deal in currency. Instead, taxes were paid in kind, that is, in food. Wheat, barley, flax, vegetables, fruit, sometimes even livestock. All of it was taken by the state as payment for living in the kingdom and using its land. Imagine working tirelessly for months, sowing, tending, and harvesting your fields under the scorching sun, your hands blistered and calloused, your back aching from bending over the soil day after day. You had to worry about the river flooding too much or too little, pests destroying your crops and unpredictable droughts, yet even if your harvest was successful, it wasn't really yours. The government claimed a significant portion of your yield. The officials who collected these taxes were not known for their patience or generosity. They expected their share regardless of circumstances. Whether the harvest was good, mediocre, or terrible, farmers were obligated to meet these quotas. And if you didn't, there were consequences, fines, punishment, or sometimes forced labor to make up the shortfall. The tax system was complex, deeply tied to Egypt's centralized bureaucracy, which was remarkably advanced for its time. Scribes kept meticulous records of each village, noting who owed what and who had delivered it. They recorded not only the quantities of wheat, barley, and flax, but also livestock, beer, and other agricultural products. These records were critical for maintaining the state's stability and wealth. But for farmers, they were a constant reminder that no matter how hard they worked, most of their labor benefited the elite rather than themselves. Being a farmer was like running on a treadmill that never stopped, producing food for everyone else while struggling to feed your own family. The obligations to the state went beyond mere food. Farmers were also responsible for contributing labor when needed. Sometimes this labor took the form of corvée, a system in which peasants had to work on state projects such as building temples, canals, or pyramids. These obligations were mandatory, and refusal could be met with severe punishment. This meant that even during non-farming periods, farmers could not fully rest or enjoy the fruits of their labor. They were effectively owned by the land they worked, bound by a system that demanded loyalty, compliance, and near constant effort. Taxes were not just a single annual demand. They were a continuous pressure, measured carefully by the state's officials, and often recalculated each season. If a farmer had a particularly good harvest, it was assumed that they could give more. If the harvest was poor, they were expected to make up the difference, sometimes by borrowing from wealthier neighbors or using stored provisions, which could plunge them into a cycle of debt that was difficult to escape. The balance between survival and obligation was delicate, and many families lived on the edge, always at risk of famine or punishment. The physical process of delivering taxes was itself a challenge. Farmers had to transport their goods, often sacks of grain, baskets of vegetables, or bundles of flax, sometimes over long distances, to collection points or officials' estates. Roads were basic or non-existent, and travel was slow and exhausting. Carrying a heavy load under the hot sun, across uneven terrain, or along narrow canals required strength, endurance, and resilience. During these trips, there was also the constant worry of theft, accidents, or spoilage. Spoiled grain or damaged produce could mean additional fines or forced labor, further compounding the farmers' burdens. In addition to paying their due, farmers often had to prepare extra provisions for religious ceremonies and festivals, which were intricately tied to the state. Temples demanded offerings, which were considered part of a farmer's duty to the gods and the community. This meant that even beyond the official taxes, farmers contributed substantial portions of their produce to religious institutions. These contributions were often symbolic but carried real economic weight, further straining families who were already giving most of their harvest to the state. The line between religious obligation and civic duty was blurred, leaving farmers with little time or resources for themselves. The social and psychological effects of this system were profound. Farmers knew that no matter how hard they worked, the majority of their output would be taken. Their labor was essential to the survival of the kingdom, yet they rarely received direct recognition or reward. This created a sense of frustration, helplessness, and dependency. The cycle of working tirelessly to produce food only to surrender it to others reinforced their lower social status, highlighting the inequality between the elite and the working class. Farmers were crucial to society, yet they had little control over their lives or the fruits of their labor. This system of taxation also reinforced hierarchies within rural communities. Wealthier landowners, who often leased land to farmers, had the means to buffer themselves from the harshest impacts of taxation. They could store surplus crops, negotiate with officials, or maintain larger staffs of laborers to ensure quotas were met. Poorer farmers, in contrast, bore the full brunt of these demands. Their survival depended on working harder, borrowing, or sometimes making impossible choices between feeding their families and paying the state. This disparity reinforced social stratification, making it clear that while all farmers suffered, some suffered more than others. Despite these hardships, the tax system was remarkably organized, reflecting the sophistication of ancient Egyptian administration. Officials and scribes meticulously measured fields, recorded yields, and calculated taxes based on land size, soil fertility, and crop type. Surveys were conducted, sometimes using rudimentary measuring ropes and units, to ensure accuracy. While this precision benefited the state, for farmers it meant constant oversight and scrutiny. Any discrepancy could be interpreted as evasion or incompetence, leading to punishment. The sense of being constantly monitored added psychological stress to an already exhausting life. Moreover, the unpredictability of nature added another layer of anxiety. Flooding was both a blessing and a curse. When the Nile overflowed its banks in the right way, it enriched the soil and allowed crops to flourish. But if the flood was too low, too high, or came at the wrong time, the harvest could fail. Farmers still owed taxes to the state, regardless of these natural variances, leaving them vulnerable to famine or indebtedness. This unpredictability made long-term planning almost impossible and heightened the constant tension between survival and obligation. Famine was a real and terrifying possibility. A poor harvest could have devastating consequences, not just for the farmer's household but for entire villages. Crops were often stored in communal granaries or state-controlled facilities, and food shortages could spread quickly. In such situations, taxes remained a legal requirement, yet meeting them could mean starvation for one's family. Some farmers tried to protect themselves by cultivating surplus crops or maintaining small personal plots hidden from authorities, but these measures were risky. Discovery could lead to confiscation, punishment, or forced labor. The psychological burden of working constantly under these conditions cannot be overstated. Farmers had to endure long days of backbreaking work, constant exposure to the elements, the threat of pests and disease, and the looming obligation to provide a substantial portion of their produce to the state. The knowledge that much of their effort would benefit others rather than themselves was demoralizing. Yet, this was the reality of life in ancient Egypt, a society that thrived on the labor of its farmers, who worked tirelessly to sustain both the population and the grandeur of the state. Family life was intertwined with this system. Children were expected to contribute from an early age, learning the skills of farming while helping meet the family's obligations. Parents could not afford to allow children leisure or education beyond practical training. Every member of the household had a role to play in ensuring that quotas were met and that the family survived. This shared labor created strong familial bonds, but also perpetuated the cycle of toil. Success or failure was never individual, it was communal, and the pressure to provide was felt collectively by the family. The economic consequences of taxation extended beyond immediate survival. Farmers who consistently struggled to meet their obligations could fall into cycles of debt, borrowing from wealthier neighbors or local elites to pay their dues. Interest, repayment, and additional obligations could trap families in long-term servitude or forced labor, creating a situation not unlike indentured servitude. For many, life was a constant negotiation between meeting the state's demands and ensuring that their own household survived another year. Even the choice of crops was influenced by taxation. Farmers were often encouraged, or sometimes required, to grow specific grains or crops deemed necessary for state or temple needs. This limited their autonomy and creativity, forcing them to prioritize what the state demanded over what might best sustain their own family. Crop rotation, experimentation, or diversification was a luxury few could afford. Their agricultural decisions were dictated by survival and obligation rather than personal preference or innovation. Despite these enormous challenges, farmers were essential to the functioning of ancient Egyptian society. Without their labor, the state would not have survived. Food production underpinned every aspect of civilization. It supported the elite, enabled monumental construction projects, sustained the army, and fed the growing urban population. The efficiency and organization of taxation allowed the state to thrive, but it did so at the expense of the very people who made it all possible. The irony was stark. The farmers' suffering directly contributed to the prosperity and stability of the kingdom, yet recognition and reward for their efforts were minimal. In some cases, farmers did find ways to cope. Social networks, communal labor, and shared resources helped mitigate some of the burdens. Families pooled labor to manage fields and transport taxes. Villages collaborated to repair canals, protect crops, and support each other during times of shortage. Religion also offered some comfort. Many farmers participated in rituals and offerings, believing that pleasing the gods would ensure good harvests and protection from disaster. While these practices did not lessen the workload, they provided a sense of agency and hope in a life dominated by obligation. Yet, the harsh reality remained. Taxes in ancient Egypt were relentless, demanding, and often unforgiving. They transformed the simple act of growing food into a high-stakes endeavor, where every seed sown, every field plowed, and every grain harvested was measured against state expectations. Farmers lived in a constant tension between duty and survival, their labor feeding not only their own families but the entire civilization. Their efforts were the foundation of society, yet their lives were marked by toil, deprivation, and the unyielding pressure of obligations that never ceased. In essence, paying taxes in ancient Egypt was not merely a financial or economic transaction. It was a defining feature of a farmer's life. It shaped daily routines, dictated labor, influenced crop choices, and framed social relationships. It created physical, economic, and psychological pressures that permeated every aspect of existence. The system was sophisticated and effective, but for the farmers themselves, it was a source of relentless hardship, a reminder that even the fruits of their labor were not entirely their own. Life as a farmer in ancient Egypt was an intricate balance of toil, survival, and obligation, with taxes at the center, demanding attention, endurance, and resilience day after day, season after season. And if taxes weren't enough to make life miserable for ancient Egyptian farmers, nature itself seemed determined to conspire against them at every turn. Disease, pests, plagues, and the sheer unpredictability of the environment added layers of danger and stress to an already grueling existence. Farming was not just hard work, it was a constant battle against forces beyond human control, a daily struggle to survive in a world where a single misfortune could destroy everything a family had worked for. From the moment a farmer stepped into the fields, he faced risks that modern society can hardly imagine. Sun exposure was relentless. The Egyptian sun, intense and unforgiving, scorched the earth and burned exposed skin. Farmers often worked barefoot or in simple sandals, their legs and arms exposed to the elements for hours at a time. Sunburn was a constant concern, and without modern remedies, even moderate burns could become painful infections. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common, especially during the peak of summer. Farmers had to rely on the Nile for water, but even then, drinking water was not always clean, which introduced additional risks of disease. In addition to the sun, farmers faced biting insects and disease-carrying creatures that lurked in and around the fields. Mosquitoes bred in stagnant waters, spreading fevers and illnesses. Flies swarmed around food and animals, contaminating supplies and increasing the risk of infections. Snakes, scorpions, and crocodiles were constant threats near the canals and irrigation ditches. A single misstep could result in serious injury or death, yet farmers had no choice but to navigate these dangers daily in order to feed themselves and meet the demands of the state. Pests were another persistent problem. Locust swarms, for example, could descend suddenly and devastate entire crops. Fields of wheat or barley could be stripped bare in a matter of hours, leaving farmers with nothing to harvest. Rodents, too, were relentless, gnawing at stored grains and vegetables and further reducing the yield. Farmers had to remain vigilant constantly, building protective granaries, using scare tactics, and manually chasing away pests. But even the most careful preparations could fail in the face of nature's unpredictability. A bad swarm or an infestation at the wrong time could mean famine for the family and a shortfall in the taxes owed to the state. Diseases posed yet another, often invisible threat. Without knowledge of germs or sanitation, illnesses spread quickly among farming communities. Minor cuts and scrapes from thorns, tools, or animals could become infected, leading to severe illness or even death. Parasitic worms in the soil or water caused long-term health problems, weakening farmers over time. Malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses were common, and there was little that could be done once someone became sick. Families lived in constant fear of outbreaks, which could decimate villages in a single season. Beyond individual health, farmers were also at the mercy of crop-specific diseases. Blights, fungal infections, and mildew could ruin harvests in days. These diseases could spread rapidly, and without chemical treatments or modern fungicides, farmers had few tools to combat them. A farmer could meticulously plant, water, and tend his fields for months, only to watch helplessly as disease struck, destroying his hard work. And yet the state expected the same yield regardless of these natural setbacks. Families who experienced crop failure due to disease were often plunged into crisis, forced to borrow from neighbors, ration food, or seek work elsewhere to meet obligations. Floods and droughts also played a central role in the precariousness of a farmer's life. The Nile's annual flooding was both a blessing and a curse. When timed correctly and at the right level, floods deposited nutrient-rich silt that made fields fertile for planting. But floods were unpredictable. Too much water, and fields were destroyed, crops washed away, and homes flooded. Too little water, and the soil remained dry, crops withered, and famine loomed. Farmers had to rely on careful observation, oral traditions, and years of experience to predict and respond to these natural cycles. Even then, a single miscalculation could result in ruin. The stress of this constant vigilance weighed heavily on families, adding to the physical and mental burdens of daily life. The psychological toll of such constant threats cannot be overstated. Farmers lived with a pervasive sense of uncertainty and vulnerability. Every day they balanced the immediate demands of labor with the unpredictable forces of nature, all while trying to provide enough food to survive and meet tax obligations. Fear of famine, injury, disease, and financial collapse was ever present. This anxiety shaped daily decisions, from what crops to plant to how to store food, and dictated the rhythms of life in a way that modern society, buffered by technology and infrastructure, can barely comprehend. In addition to environmental and biological threats, farmers had to contend with social and structural pressures. Villages were tightly knit, but competition for resources was common. Disputes over land boundaries, water rights, or shared labor could escalate quickly, further complicating an already difficult existence. Farmers were dependent on one another for mutual support. Yet that dependency also created vulnerability. A neighbor's misfortune could directly affect one's own survival. Cooperative efforts such as communal irrigation projects or pest control were essential, but they required coordination, negotiation, and hard labor. Failure of the community to act effectively could result in disaster for everyone involved. Plagues, both localized and more widespread, also threatened farmers' lives. Periodic outbreaks of disease could sweep through villages, killing livestock, destroying crops, and reducing human populations. The causes of these plagues were poorly understood, and remedies were often based on superstition rather than science. Farmers might turn to ritual, prayer, or offerings to the gods in hopes of protection, but these measures offered little real defense. The experience of living through such crises was one of constant fear and uncertainty, requiring resilience, ingenuity, and a strong communal network to survive. Insects and small animals were a daily nuisance, but could also have severe economic consequences. Termites could weaken storage structures, rodents could devour stored grain, and birds could decimate seedlings in the field. Farmers had to be vigilant, building protective barriers, using scarecrows or noisemakers, and monitoring crops constantly. Even these measures were not foolproof, and the labor required added to an already overwhelming workload. A single infestation could undo months of effort, leaving families with little to eat and less to pay in taxes. Access to health care was minimal. Farmers relied on traditional remedies, herbs, and superstition to treat illnesses and injuries. A small wound could fester into a serious infection. Gastrointestinal illnesses were common due to contaminated water or food. Respiratory diseases spread easily in crowded or dusty conditions. Mothers and wives often bore the responsibility of caring for sick family members, while simultaneously tending to fields, maintaining homes, and preparing food. The labor of illness was both physical and emotional, compounding the already immense burdens of daily life. Seasonal changes also brought specific threats. During the hot months, dehydration, heatstroke, and exhaustion were significant risks. During cooler or rainy periods, hypothermia, fungal infections, and waterborne illnesses could spread rapidly. Farmers had to adapt constantly, adjusting their work schedules, clothing, and labor intensity to cope with changing conditions. Failure to adapt could result in illness, injury, or poor harvests, demonstrating the intricate relationship between human effort and environmental conditions in ancient Egyptian agriculture. Moreover, farmers' lives were intertwined with livestock, which provided labor, food, and trade goods. Animals were not immune to disease or injury, and a sick or dead animal could cripple a family's ability to work the land. Care for animals was labor-intensive, requiring feeding, watering, and protection from predators or disease. The health of livestock directly impacted crop yields and the family's ability to meet tax obligations, creating additional stress and responsibility. Even food storage was fraught with danger. Grain and vegetables had to be stored carefully to prevent spoilage and theft. Improperly stored food could attract pests or mold, leading to significant losses. Farmers built granaries, used rudimentary preservation methods, and monitored their stores closely, but nothing could guarantee that a stored harvest would remain intact until it was needed. The fear of losing one's food to spoilage or pests added a constant undercurrent of anxiety to daily life. Religious beliefs intersected with these practical realities. Farmers often attributed natural disasters, plagues, and crop failures to the will of the gods. Rituals, offerings, and prayers were common strategies to seek divine protection and ensure future success. Temples and priests played a central role in interpreting these events, offering guidance, and enforcing religious observances. While these practices provided hope and structure, they did little to mitigate the actual physical challenges faced by farmers, leaving them dependent on a combination of labor, observation, and faith to survive. Despite the overwhelming challenges, farmers developed remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They learned to anticipate floods, rotate crops, manage pests, and maximize limited resources. Knowledge passed down through generations included careful observation of weather patterns, animal behavior, and soil conditions. Farmers experimented with planting techniques, irrigation methods, and crop management, developing a practical understanding of agriculture that allowed them to survive in a harsh and unpredictable environment. This expertise, however, was often undervalued and taken for granted by the elite in the state, which relied on farmers' labor without offering corresponding security or reward. Social and familial structures were crucial to managing the pressures of disease, pests, and plagues. Extended families often lived and worked together, pooling labor to maintain fields, care for sick members, and defend against environmental threats. Communities collaborated on larger projects, such as maintaining canals, building protective structures, or responding to localized disasters. Mutual aid was essential for survival, yet it could never eliminate the individual burdens each farmer faced. The constant presence of risk required vigilance, coordination, and a willingness to endure hardship collectively. In essence, life as a farmer in ancient Egypt was a continuous negotiation with nature's challenges. Disease, pests, plagues, and environmental unpredictability were ever present, shaping every aspect of daily existence. Farmers had to labor tirelessly, adapt constantly, and maintain resilience in the face of adversity. Their work was both physically and psychologically demanding, requiring strength, intelligence, and endurance. While they were essential to the survival and prosperity of the state, their own lives were marked by vulnerability, uncertainty, and relentless toil. Even with all these challenges, farmers persevered. They managed to produce enough food to sustain themselves, their families, and the kingdom, demonstrating an extraordinary capacity for endurance and ingenuity. Their lives were shaped by hardship, yet through adaptation, knowledge, and communal effort, they maintained a civilization that would leave a legacy for millennia. The very survival of ancient Egypt depended on these men and women, who faced disease, pests, and plagues with courage and resilience, often without recognition, reward, or relief. Life as a farmer in ancient Egypt was not only physically grueling and fraught with natural dangers, but it also offered almost no respite from labor. Unlike modern societies, where weekends, holidays, and vacations provide relief from work, the lives of these farmers were dominated by an unbroken cycle of toil that left little room for rest, leisure, or personal pursuits. From sunrise to sunset, day after day, the rhythm of a farmer's life was dictated by necessity, the demands of the state, and the relentless push of survival. The concept of leisure, as we understand it, was virtually non-existent, replaced instead by a series of obligations that extended far beyond the fields. Farmers had no choice but to rise early each day, often before the first rays of the sun illuminated the Nile Valley, and begin the demanding tasks of preparing fields, tending crops, and managing water systems. The workday began with heavy labor, plowing dense clay-rich soil, using wooden plows pulled by oxen or donkeys. This alone was physically taxing. Each pass of the plow required precise control, endurance, and strength, as the tools were rudimentary, heavy, and inefficient by modern standards. The soil was often hard and dry, making it difficult to break, or muddy and slick after flooding, making movement treacherous. Every step forward demanded effort, sweat, and careful attention to avoid accidents. Plowing was often followed by sowing seeds, which had to be done manually with meticulous attention to spacing and depth, as improper planting could jeopardize the harvest. Even after plowing and sowing, work continued relentlessly. Farmers weeded the fields to prevent unwanted plants from choking the crops, repaired irrigation canals to ensure water reached every section of land, and protected their fields from pests, floods, or other unforeseen challenges. These tasks were never-ending. Nature itself was uncooperative, and any delay or failure could spell disaster. Unlike modern workers, Farmers did not have machinery, chemical fertilizers, or pesticides to ease their workload. Their entire survival depended on human labor, ingenuity, and endurance. The social expectations and obligations placed upon farmers added another layer of unceasing pressure. Beyond tending their own plots, farmers were often required to provide labor for communal projects or for the state. During periods outside the planting or harvesting seasons, Corvée labor, mandatory public work, was common. Farmers were conscripted to build or maintain canals, fortifications, temples, or even pyramids. These projects were demanding, often involving heavy lifting, construction, and long hours under the scorching sun. Participation was not optional. Refusal could result in fines, corporal punishment, or even imprisonment. This meant that farmers were never truly free from labor, even when they were not actively working their own land. Religious obligations further encroached upon farmers' time. The ancient Egyptians were deeply religious, and the state intertwined religion with civic duties. Festivals, ceremonies, and offerings required farmers to contribute not only produce but also labor. Preparing for these events was labor-intensive. Fields were cleared to provide offerings, animals were raised or slaughtered, and preparations were made to honor the gods. Participation was expected and often enforced by local authorities or temple officials. While these events may have offered temporary breaks from routine work, they rarely provided genuine rest, as the labor required to participate could be just as exhausting as farming itself. The seasonal nature of agriculture dictated the tempo of a farmer's life, but even seasonal breaks were minimal. Inundation season, when the Nile flooded and deposited fertile silt, required intense labor to repair canals and prepare fields once the waters receded. Planting season involved long hours of meticulous care to ensure seeds were properly sown, while the growing season demanded constant attention to irrigation, pest control, and crop maintenance. Harvesting was an even more intense period, as crops had to be collected quickly to prevent spoilage, theft, or destruction by pests. Each of these stages came with its own relentless demands, leaving farmers little opportunity to rest or attend to personal needs. The daily grind was compounded by the lack of tools and technologies to ease labor. Wooden plows, basic hoes, and simple irrigation tools required skill and effort to use effectively. Transporting harvested crops to storage or distribution points was physically demanding, often involving carrying heavy sacks over uneven terrain. Farmers had to repair their tools, maintain irrigation channels, and protect their crops from environmental hazards, all without modern conveniences. Each task required sustained physical effort, often under extreme heat, humidity, or the hazards of floodwaters. The sheer repetition of these tasks, day after day, contributed to chronic fatigue, injuries, and long-term physical strain. Children were incorporated into this cycle of labor from a very young age. Boys and girls were expected to help in the fields, learning essential skills while contributing to the family's survival. Play and leisure were secondary to survival, and education was practical rather than academic, focused on skills such as planting, harvesting, irrigation management, and pest control. From an early age, children experienced the relentless demands of agricultural life, ensuring that labor was a central part of their identity and daily routine. Illness, injury, and exhaustion were constant threats that could disrupt an already punishing schedule. Farmers were exposed to extreme sun, unpredictable floods, biting insects, and dangerous animals. Minor injuries could become infected. Fatigue could lead to accidents, and disease could incapacitate entire families. Despite these risks, there was little room for recovery. Farmers had to continue working, as failing to meet obligations could have severe consequences for the family. The combination of physical hardship, environmental hazards, and social expectations created a life in which continuous labor was not just expected. It was necessary for survival. Even daily meals were integrated into the cycle of work, rather than providing a true break. Meals were simple and functional, designed to provide energy rather than enjoyment. Bread, onions, leeks, and occasionally fish or meat were staples, consumed quickly before returning to the fields. There was little time for relaxation, conversation, or leisure, and eating itself was often interrupted by labor, travel, or communal obligations. Food was both sustenance and necessity, another factor linking every moment of life to survival and labor. Community dynamics further reinforced the relentless nature of a farmer's life. Villages were often organized around cooperative labor systems, where multiple families worked together to maintain irrigation canals, share labor, and respond to crises. While cooperation provided some support, it also meant that each farmer's labor contributed to obligations beyond their own household. Communal expectations were enforced socially and sometimes legally, creating pressure to participate continuously. Social cohesion was necessary for survival, yet it also ensured that farmers were rarely free from work, as obligations extended beyond individual fields and families. Weather and environmental conditions dictated daily schedules, often leaving little flexibility. The intensity of the sun required adjustments to working hours, yet even these adjustments were constrained by agricultural needs. Farmers could not simply rest during critical periods, as delays in plowing, planting, or harvesting could jeopardize crops and survival. Work was dictated by the rhythms of nature rather than personal preference, making the cycle of labor inescapable. Even adverse conditions such as heavy rain, extreme heat, or flooding could not provide an excuse to pause. Farmers had to adapt, improvise, and continue working despite discomfort and danger. Seasonal festivals, while culturally significant, were rarely restful. Participation required preparation, labor, and contribution, further blending work with social and religious obligations. For example, during the Opet festival or other state-sanctioned events, farmers might be required to provide food, carry offerings, or assist in construction and maintenance. These duties reinforced the intertwining of labor with every aspect of life, leaving little room for genuine rest. Even moments that might have offered respite were often consumed by obligations, blurring the line between work and social participation. The physical toll of continuous labor was immense. Chronic fatigue, musculoskeletal strain, back problems, and joint pain were common among farmers. Long-term exposure to sun, water, and repetitive motions caused injuries and long-term health issues. The body was a constant tool of labor, and its maintenance was essential for survival. Farmers had to navigate their work carefully, balancing effort with the need to preserve their strength, yet exhaustion was unavoidable. The cumulative effect of years of unrelenting labor shaped every aspect of a farmer's existence, from physical capability to daily routine, social engagement, and mental resilience. Even small moments of rest were often interrupted. Nap times could be cut short by tasks that demanded immediate attention, water management, crop inspection, or pest control. Meals might be interrupted by the arrival of officials, neighbors, or communal obligations. Sleep was precious but frequently compromised by worry, environmental hazards, or early morning labor requirements. The cycle of work was continuous, demanding, and unavoidable, leaving farmers with little opportunity for physical or mental recovery. Family life was structured entirely around labor. Each member had responsibilities, and failure to contribute could jeopardize the entire household. Tasks were divided based on age, strength, and skill, creating a highly organized but demanding family economy. Work was intergenerational, with knowledge, skills, and expectations passed down from parents to children. Personal freedom and individual pursuits were subordinated to survival and productivity, embedding labor deeply into the fabric of daily life. The relentless schedule shaped not only physical endurance, but also mental outlook, fostering resilience, discipline, and an intimate understanding of the land and its demands. Even leisure, when it occurred, was closely tied to labor and survival. Storytelling, music, and religious rituals provided brief mental respite but were often accompanied by work or preparation. Any form of entertainment or relaxation was secondary, limited in scope and integrated into broader social obligations. Farmers could not afford prolonged distraction or indulgence, as failure to meet agricultural, social, or state demands could have immediate consequences. The concept of true rest free from duty or responsibility was largely foreign. In sum, the life of a farmer in ancient Egypt was defined by continuous labor without breaks, spanning physical work, social obligations, and survival strategies. There were no weekends, vacations, or periods of leisure in the modern sense. Daily routines were dictated by environmental conditions, agricultural demands, state requirements, religious obligations, and community expectations. The cumulative effect of these pressures created a life that was exhausting, relentless, and unforgiving. Farmers had to endure physical strain, environmental hazards, social pressure, and economic insecurity, while producing the essential resources that sustained both themselves and the broader society. Even in the overwhelmingly harsh and exhausting life of an ancient Egyptian farmer, there existed small, often overlooked moments of reprieve, subtle advantages, and brief glimpses of satisfaction that provided some relief from the relentless cycle of labor. While these tiny upsides could never erase the physical hardships, the constant threat of disease, the environmental dangers, or the heavy taxes, they played a crucial role in sustaining life, morale, and resilience. They offered farmers a sense of purpose, moments of control, and fleeting satisfaction that made the impossible demands of survival slightly more bearable. These small benefits, though modest, were woven into the fabric of daily life, giving farmers the motivation to continue in a world dominated by labor and necessity. One of the most significant advantages available to farmers was their connection to the Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt. The annual flooding of the Nile, while unpredictable and sometimes destructive, deposited nutrient-rich silt across the fields, naturally fertilizing the land and allowing crops to grow abundantly. This natural enrichment of the soil created a foundation for agricultural success that would have been impossible in a less fertile environment. The river provided not only water for irrigation but also opportunities for fishing, bathing, and even small-scale trade along its banks. Farmers developed intimate knowledge of the Nile's patterns, learning to anticipate its rise and fall, which allowed them to plan planting and harvesting around the river's cycles. While floods and droughts remained threats, the Nile's presence was a consistent resource, giving farmers a lifeline in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Another advantage came in the form of personal plots and the portion of the harvest that farmers were allowed to retain for themselves. Despite heavy taxation and Corvée labor demands, farmers could cultivate small plots of land for family consumption. These plots were often where vegetables, legumes, and herbs were grown to supplement the basic staple of bread. Onions, leeks, garlic, lentils, and occasionally fruit such as dates or figs added variety and nutritional value to the family diet. These personal plots were not just functional, they provided a sense of ownership, control, and immediate reward for labor. A successful crop in these private fields offered a rare moment of security and satisfaction, as it directly benefited the family without being siphoned off to the state or the temple. Livestock represented another minor but meaningful advantage. Families often kept goats, sheep, and poultry, which served multiple purposes: food, trade, and labor assistance. A healthy goat could provide milk and occasionally meat, while sheep could supply wool for clothing and warmth. Chickens or ducks produced eggs, which were valuable for nutrition, trade, and ritual offerings. While caring for animals increased labor, it also offered resilience against crop failure. If fields were destroyed by floods, pests, or drought, livestock could serve as a buffer, providing sustenance, economic value, and a form of insurance. This ability to maintain animals required skill and attention but rewarded farmers with resources that directly supported survival and quality of life. Community cooperation also offered subtle advantages. Villages and small settlements relied on shared labor to maintain irrigation canals, repair levees, and protect crops. Working collectively allowed farmers to accomplish tasks that would be impossible individually, distributing labor and sharing expertise. Social bonds within these communities provided emotional support, safety, and practical assistance. A farmer might rely on neighbors during a flood or pest infestation, receiving help in exchange for labor or goods at other times. This interdependence created a system of mutual aid that, while demanding, helped farmers manage risk and sustain both crops and livelihoods. The presence of supportive community networks offered psychological comfort and a sense of belonging, crucial in a life filled with constant uncertainty. The seasonal rhythms of agriculture, although grueling, provided structure and predictability. Farmers learned to interpret weather patterns, soil conditions, and signs of the Nile's behavior. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, allowed farmers to anticipate challenges and adapt their strategies for planting, irrigation, and harvesting. While success was never guaranteed, the ability to observe, predict, and influence outcomes through skill and diligence offered a sense of agency. Each successful harvest was tangible evidence that labor, experience, and attentiveness could yield results, however modest, reinforcing confidence and perseverance in a life otherwise dictated by external forces. Religious practices, rituals, and festivals offered additional, albeit limited, reprieve. Participation in temple ceremonies, offerings, and seasonal festivals required labor and contribution, but these events also provided psychological and social benefits. Belief in divine protection and intervention offered hope, particularly in the face of disasters such as floods, pests, or disease. Festivals provided rare moments of communal gathering, music, and celebration, allowing brief mental and emotional relief from the monotony and stress of daily life. Though these events often reinforced obligations and social hierarchies, they also offered a sense of connection to a larger society, spiritual comfort, and cultural identity. Education and skill transmission within families further reinforced these small upsides. Children learned practical agricultural skills, irrigation management, pest control, and livestock care from a young age, ensuring that knowledge and expertise were preserved across generations. This intergenerational transfer of knowledge was vital for survival, providing each new generation with tools to navigate the environmental and social challenges of farming life. Practical education offered both competence and confidence, equipping children to contribute meaningfully to the household economy and ensuring continuity even under difficult circumstances. Small successes, no matter how limited, carried outsized importance. A bountiful harvest, an intact granary, a healthy animal, or a well-maintained canal represented tangible achievement and security. Each success, though brief and fragile, was deeply meaningful because it demonstrated that effort could produce results, even in a life dominated by uncertainty. Farmers could take pride in their skill, endurance, and knowledge, finding satisfaction in their ability to provide for their families and sustain their households. These small victories offered mental reinforcement, motivation, and a sense of stability in a world characterized by relentless demands and risks. Yet even with these minor advantages, the overarching reality of life as a farmer was unyielding. The relentless rhythm of labor, the environmental hazards, the social and economic obligations, and the constant pressure to meet state and community expectations defined existence. Farmers were subject to extreme physical demands from dawn until dusk, navigating heavy plowing, irrigation, sowing, weeding, harvesting, and animal care without modern tools or conveniences. Every task required endurance, skill, and vigilance, and failure could have immediate consequences for the family's survival and well-being. The combination of physical exertion, environmental risk, and social expectation created an unbroken cycle of work with little opportunity for rest or recovery. Taxes claimed the majority of a farmer's production, ensuring that the fruits of labor primarily benefited the state and elite classes rather than the family itself. Corvée labor further extracted time and energy, conscripting farmers for state projects such as canal construction, temple building, or monument maintenance. Participation was mandatory, and refusal was met with punishment. Environmental threats compounded the relentless workload. Floods, droughts, pests, crop disease, and livestock illness created a precarious existence, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation. Survival depended not only on physical strength, but also on mental resilience, knowledge, and the ability to navigate risks without the benefits of modern safety nets. Family life was inseparable from these demands. Children contributed labor from a young age, and adults balanced the care of household members, crops, and animals simultaneously. Obligations to neighbors, community projects, religious participation, and state demands meant that labor extended far beyond individual fields. Leisure was minimal, meals were functional, and sleep was often interrupted or curtailed. Social, economic, and environmental pressures created a life where work, survival, and responsibility were inseparable, and moments of relief were temporary and conditional. Even the psychological and spiritual dimensions of life reinforced the relentlessness. Farmers were constantly aware of mortality, vulnerability, and dependence on external forces. Religious belief offered comfort but also imposed obligations, linking labor to divine expectations. Festivals, rituals, and temple participation provided cultural cohesion and emotional sustenance, but required effort and resources. Knowledge of agriculture, environmental observation, and skillful management offered some control but did not eliminate the persistent risk of failure. Farmers lived under a perpetual tension between survival and disaster, success and loss, labor and exhaustion. Despite this, farmers exhibited remarkable resilience. They mastered irrigation techniques, crop rotation, and pest management. They maintained livestock and managed food storage effectively. They cooperated with neighbors, transmitted knowledge intergenerationally, and navigated the social and economic hierarchies of their society. Each success, however small, reinforced the value of endurance, skill, and adaptability. These abilities allowed them to persist in a life where the pressures of survival were relentless and the rewards were modest. The combination of tiny upsides and relentless reality created a complex existence. Farmers experienced moments of hope, satisfaction, and mastery alongside unbroken cycles of labor, risk, and obligation. Access to fertile land, small personal plots, livestock, community cooperation, and cultural practices offered threads of support, while environmental hazards, labor demands, taxes, corvée labor, and social hierarchy ensured that life was never easy or secure. This duality, the faint benefits against a backdrop of ceaseless toil, defined the lived experience of ancient Egyptian farmers. Ultimately, the life of a farmer in ancient Egypt was a study in endurance and adaptation. Tiny upsides provided essential support and occasional relief, giving farmers reasons to persevere, hope to sustain their labor, and moments of accomplishment to reinforce resilience. Simultaneously, the relentless reality of environmental hazards, labor demands, taxation, and social obligations created a life of continuous challenge and responsibility. Understanding this duality is crucial to appreciating both the human cost of ancient agriculture and the remarkable resilience that allowed farmers to sustain themselves, their families, and the civilization built upon their labor. These farmers, largely invisible in the grand narratives of pharaohs, pyramids, and temples, were the backbone of ancient Egypt. Their lives, defined by both modest rewards and relentless demands, created the conditions necessary for one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. By recognizing both the tiny upsides and the relentless reality, we gain insight not only into their endurance and skill, but also into the broader societal structures that depended on their labor, ingenuity, and resilience. It was a life of struggle, yes, but also a life of adaptation, knowledge, and perseverance, where even the smallest victories mattered, and where survival itself was an achievement worthy of recognition. So there you have it. Ancient Egyptian farming was hot, hard, and often hopeless. They built the pyramids, kept the kingdom fed, and survived floods, pests, and taxes that could make your head spin. Respect farmers. Truly, the unsung heroes of history. Next time you complain about your 9 to 5, just imagine carrying a basket of onions under a blazing sun, praying your taxes don't eat your lunch. Yeah. That's why it sucked being a farmer in ancient Egypt.